To discuss the issue and more, I am joined from New Delhi by Professor Swaran Singh from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, by far one of India's best known experts on China. Welcome to Northeast Tonight. Let me go to you first, Professor Swaran Singh. What's going on? Do you think that China is trying to legitimize its border push? Do you think that China, by passing the land boundary law on the 23rd of October, is preparing the grounds to make it part of the state policy to actually, hold on to areas it has been illegally occupying since decades, and at the same time building new infrastructure for the use of both its military and civilians? What do you think?
Thank you, Basweer. There are multiple ways one can look at this land border law being passed on 23rd of October. There has been much greater uproar or demand for protecting maritime boundaries, which remain largely disputed. So last year, for example, China did pass similar laws for the Coast Guard law and of course for their maritime traffic security and safety law. But this land border law is very strange because China has 14 land border countries, and it has one temporary agreement with Pakistan, which is almost the most allied ally of Chinese. Then it is Bhutan and India. With Bhutan, you remember last month they signed an MOU to take forward their border talks.
Right.
Whereas we have seen much bigger tensions with India. So the law apparently is meant to address their concerns with India, and a lot of very interesting provisions, including the one you mentioned of quote unquote absolute control on what they call internal rivers. And of course, also talking of, there have been arrangements between China and India of no use of firepower. This law talks about how patrolling party officials can use police instructions of detaining people and even using weapons in case violence is used. And of course, third, also disallowing any permanent constructions in what they call in border areas or periphery of border regions. Does it mean even the region which India claims to be our own? And finally, I think also the domestic angle of Xi Jinping, being reinforced as a great leader, equivalent to Mao Zedong, who has had policies in 2014 of really reinforcing and forging national consciousness among China's minorities, which has been a continuing refrain of Xi Jinping. And in this case, by building border regions, saying that border region local governments have to contribute in creating what they're saying as some kind of a border militia. I think it's a very interesting way of multiple ways of looking at what this law means on the ground.
Right.
Of course, formally, MOFA says it will have no impact on existing China-India arrangements. So that should bring some relief, but there is something which is mischievous about it.
Absolutely. Professor Swaran Singh, what Mutsumithi has said is very significant. He said that people of Arunachal Pradesh have become immune to developments along the border with China. Now, we had the 1962 war, we had the Chinese occupying the Chumdurongchu Valley in 1986-87, then you have the staple visa issue. But don't you think that this people getting immune is a problem? Because I'm not saying we have full faith, because the military today, the Indian Army today is a highly professional army that has also increased its capabilities and quite capable of dealing with the Chinese threats in 2021. That was not the case in 1962. But that aside, the people getting immune to these kind of things, do you think that is a cause for concern?
Basweer, I think slightly different. I think what he's trying to say when he says people in Arunachal Pradesh have become immune, I think he's meaning immune to threats and these kind of wolf warrior posturing that Chinese do. Otherwise, you and all of us are fully aware of enormous cooperation, coordination that people of Arunachal Pradesh have invariably presented in supporting Indian Army while patrolling parties are going in the frontier areas.
Yes.
I think I want to emphasize on two very quick issues which are, implications for India. The Article 4 clearly says that in the periphery of the border regions, any permanent construction would require prior authorization by the Chinese government. It's very fuzzy. They are not saying whether it is construction inside to the Chinese side of what they think is Chinese border, or periphery also includes what is outside of what they think is the Chinese border. And if you recall, it is fundamentally infrastructure building, the road construction, which has been at the center of tensions for last 2 years now. And in that sense, it's a clear indication to what they want to tell India on what they're planning to do. Second thing I think that should concern us immediately is this shift. If you notice the August 2021 draft of this law, it was basically talking of seeking local citizens' support in management, defense, demarcation, delineation of the border. But now the final version of the law is talking of creating mass defense groups.
Yes.
Where local governments are going to provide resources. Now, that may include even manpower. Now, there is an immediate correlation here to what China has been doing in South China Sea in creating these maritime militias, where 200, 250, fishermen go and surround a particular feature and occupy it virtually, saying that they are fundamentally rescuing themselves from storms, but occupying a feature which they want to claim and assert China's control over them. And that kind of grey operations and grey zones in case of Indian border have come to light lately. And I think that is where this increasing connect of what they call creating Xiaokhan, which means either the model village or the well-off village, which will have infrastructure, food support, all kinds of other support, including manpower, to work with the both PAP, People's Armed Police, and People's Liberation Army in those frontier areas, so that they can easily sustain their forward presence. And we have seen in last 2 years now how challenging it becomes to have this forward deployment continuously. And if you are basically looking at this kind of each side trying to stress and fatigue the other side, then sustaining forward deployment is going to be something which is going to be a great asset of both sides.
Right.
And this kind of exercise of connecting development, infrastructure building to defending and managing borders with support of local villages. And I'm even reading people talking about 1,000 villages, not just the 624 as it is being claimed.
Right.
And that connect, I think, is going to give them enormous staying power, and India must reckon that. And in that kind of infrastructure war, which is going on both sides, India has to really put on much money and attention in building Indian side of infrastructure, connecting Indian population centers as well to what is happening on the frontier.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting coinage, infrastructure war going on. The point which Ninong Edingji and Mutsumi ji particularly has made, building of infrastructure. Yes, true. To take this forward, Professor Swaran Singh, in the last couple of weeks, we have seen a lot of, muscle flexing on the Indian side, because there were a group of journalists who were touring the Tawang and other sectors in Arunachal Pradesh right along the LSC, where, we have television footage of the Indian troops demonstrating their artillery, demonstrating and giving briefings to the journalists. It was a conducted tour, of course, in the forward areas. You cannot just land up and start reporting unless it is being coordinated by the Indian Army. So that is what has happened. There was a lot of coverage, and as we already know that, in 2021 and decades prior to that, Indian military has, increased their strength leaps and bounds, and we have tunnels coming right up to Tawang, through the mountains, through the high Himalayas. So this has also been in the public domain. The authorities have made no secret of these kind of activities, these kind of infra developments along the border. So, do you think that India also wants to send out a very, very clear message to the Chinese, as Professor Kondapalli was giving those details about the Indian actions, Indian response?
Basveer, you have really touched the nerve of what is important to understand. I'm saying both China and India do not wish to start a hot war. They basically want to tire each other out by constant posturing and deployment in forward areas. Now that requires two things. It requires physical infrastructure, which we have been speaking of, but it also requires social infrastructure, support of people in frontier areas to what is happening in terms of management of border by military. Now, as you just mentioned, not just our journalists, but our senior leaders, including Defense Minister, even Prime Minister, they visit these frontier areas
Yes.
and publicize their visits. All of these frontier areas, you are hearing, Mr. Methi, Mr. Ninan Arong, they are so active and visible in these debates. And they are also equally active in national parliament. So all these people have in frontier areas sense of having a direct access to national decision making. Now China has that challenge of having these minorities in this frontier area, whether it is Yunnan or Sichuan or Tibet, and they therefore for a decade are talking of ethnic assimilation. That is their focus. As Srikant just mentioned, Han Chinese are not acclimatized to stay for long in these frontier areas. And if they have to recruit people from minorities, if they have to take support of minorities, they need to really, in that sense, placate them so that they feel assimilated and, happy to work for the national cause as Beijing would like them to do. So I think Beijing may have a certain edge in terms of material infrastructure, but India definitely has a clear edge when it comes to social infrastructure, which supports India's border management in frontier areas. And of course, look at the fact that it is United States Department of Defense report last week, which talks about military and security development involving People's Republic of China. That talks about 100 house village being created south of line of actual control. So United States is conscious of what China is doing in frontier areas. Why is that? Because the whole world, most of the major powers around the world today see China as their challenge as well. And therefore, India's challenge stands in tandem with how all major powers look at China as a challenge to each of them.
Absolutely.
Whether it is in terms of infrastructure building at global level or creating new norms where issues of human rights, democracy are ignored when Chinese go out and invest in other countries. But India's concerns with regard to China, they conform to concerns of all major powers today. And therefore, not only India stands to gain in terms of its social infrastructure on the frontier areas, but also in terms of its political engagement at the global level, where India sees several countries standing by it.
Absolutely.
Simple example, look at the coordinates provided by satellites of United States to locate movement of PLA across the frontier areas for India. Immediately, all equipment, material, resources are made available, and India can import things from any of these countries at very short notice.
Correct.
Obviously, Chinese have access to only Russians. They don't have access to high altitude warfare fighting equipment from any other source.
Right.
So if you have to think of long-term deployment in tiring each other, then India's connect with the major powers, which has grown enormously lately, and India's connect on the ground in frontier areas with our own citizens.
Absolutely. Final comments from you, Professor Swaran Singh. How do you see the road ahead?
I think I fully agree, Basveer, with Mr. Methi. We have an enormous advantage over China when it comes to our social infrastructure. And we therefore need to perhaps focus much more and be more innovative. And I was delighted when you mentioned that internet is so clear when Mr. Methi is speaking from closer to LAC. And that kind of innovative approach to connecting people with mainland, connecting people with the decision making, and also taking their views as to what kind of infrastructure can actually be useful on the border areas, which can be beneficial both for the border management, but also bring relief, welfare, prosperity to local people there. And that really, is interesting. One loves to hear people mentioning from these frontier regions how patriotic they are, how close they feel to mainland India compared to mainland China. But I think they also deserve much greater attention on, creating these facilities on the ground for themselves. I'm sure lately we have seen enormous focus being devoted to building infrastructure, material infrastructure in these frontier areas. In entire Northeast, we can notice enormous connectivity of major cities, capital cities happening. But when it comes to frontier areas, I think we need to really focus much more on those areas. And I think we are increasingly going to face this assertive Chinese claim of not allowing such attempts by India to strengthen our frontier areas. And that will be the challenge for us.
Absolutely.